Hey guys, what is up? And I'm going to mod this Demolisher for some humans versus zombies. So, obviously, for this mod, I'm going to be using the Demolisher. Like I said, I'm going to be replacing the motors with RM2 motors by Solarbotics. I've been using them a lot recently because I ordered them in bulk, and I've been extremely happy with their performance, and they're really cheap. So, they just have a lot of really good things going for them. Some other things I'm going to be using for this mod, I have a container for my different screws, which is always helpful so that you don't lose any. You're going to need some various screwdrivers to open up your blaster and to remove some of the locks. For rewiring purposes, I'm going to be using wire cutters, and then the pliers help with actually removing the old motors from the housing. Some soldering supplies will be necessary. I don't have the soldering iron in this picture because it's warming up right now, but I also have my third arm tool to help me out with soldering. You're also going to need some wires. I just have red and black here. And then I'm also going to be improving the seal of the front piece, not by a lot because I don't want to have a lot of friction when I'm pulling back. I want a relatively smooth pullback. However, the stock seal is really bad from what I've seen. So you're going to need either Teflon tape or electrical tape to put under that O-ring, or you could replace the O-ring with a slightly thicker one, whatever works for you. So, like I said before, the main goals for this particular project are to improve the seal of the rocket launcher and to replace the motors and remove your standard locks to just improve general performance. I will not be painting this blaster as I normally would, just because of how cold it is. However, when it's warmer out in the spring, I'm going to be redoing a few blasters. This one is on the list. I already have the paints I want for it. I have a really cool metallic color scheme I want to do for this particular blaster without spoiling too much because it'll probably be a different video later on this year. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so after butterflying open the shell, the first piece I'm going to work on is the rocket launcher component. And now the first part of that is obviously going to be removing the actual plunger itself, which is what we're going to be doing pretty much all of the work on. And then you'll notice that it's actually covered in the stock grease, which is just to reduce friction and make it perform more smoothly. We're going to be washing this piece off to remove the grease and allow us to apply our other mods and have them stay on and apply more easily. Okay, now once you've removed the O-ring and stored it somewhere safely and then washed and dried off this piece, the first step would be to remove the dead space up here. Now there's several ways you could do that, but the easiest and potentially most effective way would just be to fill this with hot glue. Okay, so after your glue has dried and filled the gap in the top, you can do a few wraps of electrical tape and then put the O-ring back on and re-lubricate it. You're going to have to play around with it a little bit because you don't want too much friction, but you do want a nice good seal there so that if you blocked it, you could still get a good seal, whereas you're not going to get too tight of a seal. Because where you would want a really, really good seal in a spring blaster, whereas with this one you do want it to have a little bit of give to it because it is powered by just pulling it back. So you're going to want a decent in-between state for that. And you're just going to have to feel around with it. Okay, now I'm going to essentially end up rewiring this blaster completely, so if you're not comfortable with that, I would recommend just putting it back together. So to start with rewiring the blaster, I already took out some of the screws just to make this segment more easy. I would remove the trigger, and then I would remove the pusher mechanism, as we don't really need to do anything with those, and just work on this section now. The first lock I would remove is take off this plate, and then there is a lock right behind the trigger. You can see here, you could just take out this piece completely. You don't need it. And then we might as well just leave that piece out, the trigger out as well. For the rev switch, because we're going to be rewiring it like I said. So we're just going to pull that out now. And then the next one is the plate up here. Then we're going to take there's 3 screws for this particular one. We're just going to be removing all the pieces from there because we don't need them either, because that's for the magazine lock. And then this switch as well. There's one little switch holding down board in here that we don't need. And then lastly, there's another one up here, which is for the jam door. But other than that, that's pretty much everything. So basically we're going to be removing all the electronics from this particular section. And they should all come out relatively easily. Such as... Actually, they're here to go under the shell up here through a little hole. So that's moderately annoying, but I'll deal with that in a minute. So basically what you're going to end up with is this whole mess of wires here, which we're going to pretty much remove all of, and then the motor housing up here, and then the part of the shell, which is another problem that I'll go over in a second. Okay, now the orange shell actually looks really bad up close on camera, but basically we cut the two wires and we left the two stubs there coming out of that hole, essentially committing us to rewiring the whole blaster. I'll leave those in there because we're going to go back to that later, but other than that, we're pretty much removed all the wires from this side of the shell and we're going to go over to the other side. Okay, so the current predicament of this blaster is that basically what Hasbro did is there's two separate shells that are solvent welded together, with the wires being in between the two shells, which essentially makes it more complicated to actually undo. And there is some extra circuitry we want to remove back there, which is rather difficult. So your options, like I said before, are either just to leave it with stock wiring, or what you could even do is just get to this point and then just rewire it off those two. But basically I want to go all the way because that's what I think will be best. What I found is the shells are actually solvent welded together up here by this black line that I drew. So what my plan is to actually make a very small cut along that black line, not too deep because we don't want to go through the second shell. We essentially just want to cut that small section out of the first inner shell, so that way it'll allow the two shells to come apart without actually damaging the aesthetics on the outside, because like I said, I'm not painting it, so I don't really want to do any cosmetic work at the moment. So basically I'm just going to make a very small cut with my Dremel along that line in order to remove the two shells and resolder the leads from the battery tray. After a little gentle shell persuasion with the Dremel, as you can see here, it actually was fairly easy, surprisingly. I can actually remove the two shell pieces now, as I'll show you, which I haven't really seen before in terms of things I've read about online. And the surprising part is it actually didn't affect the external appearance of the blaster at all. So that front area doesn't actually, that's where the motor would sit, so there's not exactly a lot of function in that area that would be affected by that particular small cut. So although it doesn't look the best from the inside, and you could obviously choose to clean it up a little bit if you wanted to, you can now separate the two shell pieces without actually damaging the external appearance of the blaster, which is just something I haven't really seen before. So that'll actually make, when I go back and paint this blaster, that'll make it a lot easier. But the other big bonus now is we can freely resolder the wires with a heavier gauge wire to improve the performance. Next step, after you have this section of the shell down with the battery pack, as you can see, it would be to cut these particular wires leading to the terminals, and then take off the screw and remove that piece and just throw it out because you don't need it. And then next we're going to get to actually resoldering parts of, well, this particular part of the blaster. Okay, now to remove the motor, there are 4 screws which I've already removed. And then while I'm doing this, I also put a little piece of fishing line, which you can barely make out, like right here, just on the ends of the other wires that I cut, so when I pull it through, I'll have some way to pull through the new wires. So when I rewire it, it'll be a lot easier and I won't have to hopefully tear it into this side of the shell as well. Okay, so now for the motors, this is what the whole thing should look like. What we're going to be doing is replacing them. So we're going to have to cut off the bridges in between the two motors with the resistors. Even if you're not replacing the motors, I would still rewire it. So we're going to do that. And then next we're going to be taking off these black pieces and then pulling out the motors carefully and then replacing them. And I'll show you what it looks like after, because it's going to take a little bit of me fiddling around with the motors. Okay, now my new motors are in, as you can see here. They still have to be wired up. I have 2 little like jumper bridges, which they basically go from one side of the motor to the matching side on the opposite motor, and the positive one will go towards the front where the dart should be coming out, as indicated by this piece, which connects to the faux barrel. So you're going to want to wire it up so that the red jumper goes across in the front and the black one in the back, or whatever your positive and negative wires are for this blaster. And then make sure you have a good amount of lead for each particular one coming off. My black one in this case is shorter because that's the one that's going to be going to the switch, and then the red one is rather long because it's going to be going all the way to the other side of the shell to the battery pack itself. So, but you could do technically either, it doesn't really matter. But other than that, that's really all you need to do for this particular step. Just make sure you have a lot of extra lead, like I said, because it's easier to trim it down later than to add on extra, and it looks a lot nicer. When you're done, it should look something like this. When you're done, put the black pieces back over the motors and then put it back into the shell. Okay, so once you have the motor back in the casing and you have the wiring gone through, you're going to need one of these little switches that you took out before. It doesn't matter really which one, you just need one to act as the rev trigger. In this case, I'm going to be using the black wire, however you can use technically either one. Like I said before, one will just go straight to the other side of the shell. The way they had it originally was down through a channel, you can see here, and then to the other side of the shell, and then to the battery pack. However, one's going to have to go through a switch, which will be located right down here, which will act as your rev switch. So when you pull that bottom trigger, it's going to spin up the flywheels by completing the circuit. So we're going to take one of these switches and then wire it back in to the proper place down there, and then another wire will come off of that and go to your battery pack, and then you're pretty much done. Okay, now this is what your wiring should look like when it's complete. Starting from one side, you should have your two leads from your motors coming out. One of them should go to a switch right there. Then both of them should continue on and go to the appropriate places in the battery pack. The last thing I actually did was grind down the top of this little piece. There used to be a little nub at the top. I just sanded it right off with my belt sander to make it flat at the top, and that will allow me to pull the trigger without accidentally hitting the rev trigger, similar to the Strife. Other than that, I just locked down some of the wires with a little bit of hot glue, and it's time to go to our final internal shell. Okay, this is what my finished internals look like, at least for the majority of the trigger and pushing mechanism. I'll pause the video if you need to put it back together. I know it helps when I like to see internal pieces, especially if I'm not sure what they do. So if you want to check that out, or if you need this as a reference, please pause the video. Okay, now keep in mind that firing test was with stock voltage, being normal AA batteries. If you use truss fires or other such type of battery replacements, you can achieve a much higher rate of fire and initial velocity with the darts. So just keep that in mind if you decide to do this mod. Overall, I'm really happy with how this mod turns out. The missile launcher shoots a lot further now, which is great, and the stock distance, even with the stock voltage, is still a decent improvement from where the stock motors with all the resistors would have been. And then removing all of the electronic and mechanical locks really just make it a lot easier to operate and make it a bit more comfortable in terms of performance. But like I pretty much say at the end of the video, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.